America is getting into this extreme divide and conquer political polarization. You've got suicide rates at all-time high, the 10th largest cause of death in America. You've got drug addiction at all-time high. You've got wealth inequality at extremes that are causing extreme polarization. I know how Wall Street works. I know how Silicon Valley works. How do I get free? And I tell them, own more Bitcoin every month than the last month. Own more Bitcoin this week than last week. Own more Bitcoin today than you did yesterday. Self-custody it, run a node, and invest in community infrastructures. Build your freedom. So we need to decentralize money, we need to decentralize artificial intelligence, and we need to decentralize control grids through decentralized communities. If you fund your farmer, they want your farmer bankrupt because they want you having artificial food that's manufactured in some technical industrial complex. If you want to know what they want to do to the world, what it could look like, look at what they rebuild in Gaza.
Good to see you though, Simon. It's do you know, I was looking back before we did this show. When we recorded last time, I think it was on New Year's Eve last year. So final day of the year, and since then a lot has happened. And I think the best place to kind of kick off is with the US, because since then they went into Venezuela, they took out Maduro, and then they have obviously had a huge conflict in Iran, which is now potentially coming to an end. But I just wanted to get your take on everything that's happened, because this has been like a real display of power by the US. And I want to know why you think that is.
Oh, yeah. And the right word is display, because it wasn't certainly a display, but it wasn't a projection of power. And so last time we spoke, I talked about like the three pillars of who controls the Western world, and attempts to project that power globally, but has resistance against it in the form of alternate governance structures, i.e. China, and BRICS and SCO and the Gulf Cooperation Council, which are funded from sovereign wealth funds, or a public central banking system like PBOC. Whereas America projects its strength from its ability on one thing, which is your belief that you should purchase US treasuries, and that the banks think that there is sufficient enough liquidity that they're willing to prop up a whole Ponzi scheme called fiat currency based upon the belief that you will continue to purchase those treasuries and the banks can still use them as collateral. That's the entire projection of strength. As long as people continue to purchase treasuries and they can sell them into the most liquid market in the world, with the exception of foreign exchange, which is connected to the dollar anyway, then the entire financial system will produce enough money where it can be printed, roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme, and then that can be used to prop up the stock market. It can also be used to project strength through the military-industrial complex. That military-industrial complex is able to use its projection of strength in order to develop a strategy with each country. And that country might be destroy your country so that we can force you to borrow some dollars. And when you borrow those dollars, you need to store them in US treasuries. And when you store them in US treasuries, we're able to sanction them. And when we're able to sanction them, we're able to enforce that the interest on those treasuries, the yield, is spent on us building our military bases in your country. And so whenever somebody is holding money or dollars, or a country is holding treasuries within the Federal Reserve System, they are able to say, we will default on that, as they did in Russia, or we will sign defense agreements. And like a mafia racket, if you allow us to project our strength in your country and have a base there, then we're going to force you to reinvest all of that yield into US companies that then have to be converted into dollars. And those dollars, are then spent into propping up the stock market and valuing our military-industrial complex companies. And as long as you continue to do that, then the government is effectively a piggy bank and a mafia. And the only role of the people is to believe enough in the system to believe that they have a democracy or a political system that's trying to expand democracy and make the world a better place. And as long as people believe in that, then we can just get them arguing over a different flavor of the same distraction, i.e., it's the left or the right. It's the communism versus capitalism. It's the immigrants versus the local population. Whatever flavor of divide and conquer you can manufacture, you can always distract people into believing that if I just change that, then maybe my government might get smaller or it might get larger and then start serving the people, depending on which ideology you buy into. But it will always distract you that actually every politician has been bought by the financial industrial complex. The same financial industrial complex that securitizes and financializes every military company, every technology company. SpaceX is the latest one. And so the government is paying for much of the defense contracts that make up the SpaceX valuation. But through a narrative, i.e., we are in an arms race with China, we're able to project a $2 trillion valuation. And now SpaceX is able to print $2 trillion of equities that it can then go around the world and acquire companies. It's a new money printer. So every public offering is a new money printer, but who is the money printer dependent upon? In this case, the securities paper printer. Well, it's dependent upon the investment bank. The investment bank is then recycling money that is created through the commercial bank, and then it is investing money that the asset managers are pooling together in these ETFs in order to have a constant flow of money to prop up the stock market. And so, through this mechanism, you can see what was, Venezuela. Well, Venezuela was a for-rent militia army called the US military, was rented by transnational capital in order to go get Venezuelan oil. And so what does Trump do? Trump creates a narrative saying it's the drug dealers. It's something else, and then eventually over time, the beauty about Trump is it ends up in the real narrative, which is, it's about the oil, by the way. And then Americans now are all like, okay, cool. Nobody died. We only killed like 20 people. But we still, we managed to get all their oil and that projects American strength. We're okay with that. We didn't have to die for it. And who ended up getting that oil? Because America was able to project a narrative. By the way, we need that oil, and this allows us. And what actually happened during that operation? Well, China was already building the largest oil reserves in the world. So they built 1.6 billion oil reserves just based upon the ones we knew about. And they were already moving out of position and refining offshore before the Venezuela operation. That implies to me that China knew about this. Iran also was selling a lot of their drone technology in Venezuela, the same drones that could have taken out such an operation. They stood down. Russia also had significant investments and presence in Venezuela. They stood down. We've seen this one before because they did the same in Syria. This time it was Turkey and the Gulf countries that funded an ex-ISIS terrorist in order to repackage, shave their beard, and now become part of a revolutionary movement in Syria. So why did we get China, Russia, Iran, and the financial industrial complex and military industrial complex all stand down in Syria first, then Venezuela second, and then we got what happened in Iran, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz? The reason for that is because the nation state is an illusion. You have global transnational factions of power that we talked about last time that cooperate in order to get resources, and that flow of energy is what resets the world order. And what did we have prior to that? We had Russia and Ukraine, which was the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline. which is the destruction of the manufacturing base of Germany, which is the backbone of the European Union. And so what you have effectively done is you have split the world into multipolarity through multiple operations: Russia, Ukraine, Syria in the case of the Middle East, Gaza with Israel, then Venezuela, and now Iran. Now, what's the commonality in all of those? Well, they back up parts of the petrodollar and determine whether we're on a petro-yuan or petrodollar. Because remember, in 1973, when we go back 50 years ago, which was the anniversary of October the 7th, 2023, 50 years later, they transnational capital, or the CIA, assassinated King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. And after assassinating him, they forced Saudi Arabia to price their oil in dollars. And they set up a covert operation by George Bush, who were oil tycoon families, called Safari Club. And Safari Club groomed someone called Osama bin Laden. And Osama bin Laden, which was Western intelligence and Gulf intelligence, ended up doing 9/11, who was a CIA operative, Osama bin Laden, in order to justify what happened next in Libya, in Syria, in Somalia, in Sudan, in Iraq, and in the end, in Iran, as well as Lebanon along the way. So you can see that there is a multi-decade coordination that sits above governments. And that was what I mentioned, was originally the military-industrial complex that was then financialized and securitized into the financial-industrial complex. And now, why are they doing it? Because oil is less important, still very important, than LNG in a world dominated by AI. And so if we're flipping the world up to we do not have enough energy to power all of these robotics and artificial intelligence that are going to automate the world and put everyone that doesn't have assets onto a universal basic income, then we need a lot more energy. We need hydro energy. We need renewable energy. We need solar energy. We need liquefied natural gas. We need nuclear energy. Nuclear energy. So when they're talking about a nuclear program, that's just a narrative to make you believe that they're defending democracy, preventing a nuclear bomb attack, when really they're renegotiating and resetting the flows of liquefied natural gas, oil, nuclear energy, and how it's going to be priced. Is it going to be priced in yuan? Is it going to be priced in dollars? And so what else do we need to do? Well, we kind of need to break the petrodollar if we're going to split the world up. And so they broke the petrodollar. What else was signed in 1973 with the birth of the petrodollar? It was exactly what I said before, that you must price your oil in dollars. You must then use those dollars in the Federal Reserve System to purchase treasuries, and those treasuries must be reinvested in the US military-industrial complex in order to prop up a security and defense agreement and have US bases in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in UAE, in Bahrain. And Iran wouldn't do that. So Iran resisted against that and instead funded resistance groups called Hezbollah, called Hamas, called the Houthis, called the Iraq Islamic Resistance, or whatever it may be. And so what did that do? You divide and conquered the Middle East into Iran-aligned resistance and petrodollar-aligned US military bases. And then you create strategic tension. So for 50 years, after the Ayatollah had a revolution in 1979, apparently Iran was there to create death to America, death to Israel. And yet all they did is create $10 trillion of money laundering profits for the military-industrial complex. And never once until 2023 blew up Israel or targeted Israel. So for 50 years, we're led to believe that these enemies, Israel and Iran, or the Revolutionary Guard, IRGC, and the Islamic Republic, are enemies, but who benefited from it? The military-industrial complex, strategic tension. This was the British Empire model. That's why the Middle East became split up in the first place with Sykes-Picot. The French, the Brits, and the Russians said, let's put lines all around this region in West Asia. It was called West Asia at the time. Let's divide it up, make sure that there's cultural, religious, and ethnical, not ethical, ethnics, whatever. What am I trying to say? Ethnical divide. In order to make sure that we can acquire the resources, force people onto the currency, get them to acquire bonds to prop up the stock market and roll over the Ponzi scheme. And if you will go all the way back, and then I'll take a break here, who is the Federal Reserve? Well, the Federal Reserve is owned by the private banks. Who are the private banks? The private banks get to create dollars every time they issue a loan. But who is the Federal Reserve the number one shareholder in? The Bank for International Settlements. The Bank for International Settlements was set up in Switzerland in order to manage reparations after World War I and enforce Germany to seize all its gold, put it into hyperinflation, that then led to World War II, that then led to the Great Depression after the boom and bust in the 20s. So if you look at that whole sequence of events, that was the Bank for International Settlements. What is the Bank for International Settlements? Every central bank that empire conquers, the financial industrial complex and transnational capital conquers, is forced to install a debt-based Ponzi scheme in their country, which is the central bank. And that central bank must do what? Print your currency in order to pay off the interest on your dollar debt. And it required World War II to get the IMF and the World Bank and force that debt all around the world. And what happens when you print your currency to pay dollar debt? You prop up the dollar, you end up holding your reserves in treasuries, and you end up inflating away your local currency. If you inflate away your local currency, you are dollarized with your reserves. When you're dollarized with your reserves, we can regime change you. We can install a dictator to make sure that you're rich and you use your country for us, and your local people never get to use their assets. What we're witnessing today and what we've witnessed is a multi-decade operation because transnational capital, and I'll end here, made one decision, and that was to kill the petrodollar. And in order to kill the petrodollar, you need to give all the banks around the world the ability to create dollars on themselves, which is FX swap lines. UAE was given that. Don't let them sell their treasuries. Don't let them sell their equity, but give them an FX swap line. What else happened in UAE? The Bank for International Settlements handed over to UAE a network called Enbridge of central bank digital currencies. And that network of Enbridge connects through settlement rails that circumvent the SWIFT settlement rails through central bank digital currencies and connects China with Saudi Arabia, with Thailand, with UAE and Hong Kong. UAE and Hong Kong are the centers for circumventing sanctions. UAE also left OPEC. Why did they leave OPEC? Because they'd already signed an agreement with BRICS to settle energy with BRICS corridors. And so UAE also broke the other half of the petrodollar. Broke the FX, the other half of the petrodollar is that all of this oil must be used in Western interest. OPEC was originally located in Europe, in Austria. Now the head office is changing. The head office is changing eastwards. And so the reason I went on this long tangent of a big overarching zoom out here is because America is not projecting strength. America is demonstrating strength. But the American military industrial complex works for transnational capital. And transnational capital have decided that they want to hedge away from the demographic and polarized issues of American politics and set up military industrial complexes, financial industrial complexes, and technical industrial complex into a multipolar world, which then requires cooperating with the one country that they can't penetrate, which is China. And so the final part, and I know I said 3 final parts, just to give the overarching, and then we can zoom in. The war started to end on 2 events, and both of those I pointed out in advance. One was a meeting between the executives of the financial industrial complex and technical industrial complex with Xi Jinping in Beijing, with Trump as the front man, making it look like Xi Jinping and Trump are negotiated. Trump's the front man for transnational capital hosted on the most liquid stock market, the US stock market. And all the technical executives. And what were they doing? They were begging Xi Jinping behind the scenes. Are you going to allow us, Tesla, to still get access to our rare earth minerals? Because we got a shitload of electric cars we need to manufacture, and we can't do it without you. The military was saying, are you going to allow us to have our rare earth minerals? Because we're running out of bombs. And if you stop that supply, we can't bomb anybody because we bombed everyone we can. And Elon Musk was saying, are we going to be allowed to compete with Tesla, with BYD, and how are we going to split that up as we change these energy flows? And Apple, Tim Cook, was saying, is our factories to manufacture these iPhones going to be okay? Because I know Huawei has effectively, built an alternative factory that looks very similar to the Apple factory and is now pretty much further ahead in both AI and hardware. You can carry on doing that, but we need to make sure that we can rebuild our iPhones in China, because Americans, other than the wealthy, can't afford to pay an American-made iPhone. Ain't going to happen. But we need to pretend that we're bringing the manufacturing base to America, because what we're really doing is we're building AI and robotics. And we know that you do AI significantly cheaper, 10 times cheaper based upon DeepSeek. We know that you've got all the gold and commodities and silver, and we've just got paper contracts in our Ponzi scheme. We know that you can sell our bond market and our bonds are in stress above 5%. And right now, if you start selling them and Japan starts selling them, we're going to have to do Federal Reserve, and we're going to have to regime change the Fed and put Kevin Walsh in and figure out what we're going to do to increase the balance sheet. So are you going to break our commodity market, stock market, and bond market? Or are we going to build a one world control grid with our artificial intelligence and robotics that requires both China and American technical industrial complex technology that's funded by the bond market? And we need to pump a bubble on the US stock market so that when you want to rug pull us, we can have the biggest transfer of wealth the world has ever seen. Just like COVID, just like the global financial crisis, just like the Russia-Ukraine war, and just like the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So this is what I call cooperation as an alternative to World War III. That's what happened since we last spoke.
You wouldn't reuse a Bitcoin address, so why does your phone broadcast the same identifier for life? Every SIM has a static ID, and carriers, ad networks, and bad actors all use it to track you. The big carriers have been caught selling that data over and over again. Cape is America's privacy-first mobile carrier. Their identifier rotation feature changes your ID every 24 hours, so you look like a different subscriber every single day. And SIM swaps are off the table. Your number can't move without a 24-word phrase that only you hold. There's also no name at sign-up, no social security number, and there's no profile to build on you. If you're a Bitcoiner in America, I honestly don't know why you'd use any other network. You can head over to cape.co/WBD and use the code WBD for 33% off your first 6 months. That's cape.co/WBD. Bitcoiners, as you know, with fiat money constantly debasing, wealth preservation isn't optional. That's why I recommend Swan Bitcoin, a team of dedicated Bitcoiners who work with families and businesses to build and secure generational wealth with Bitcoin. Strong relationships with clients are at the center of everything Swan does. A dedicated Swan Private Wealth representative, which is a real person that you can text and call, will help you build a Bitcoin wealth strategy using Swan's comprehensive platform of Bitcoin services, including tax-advantaged retirement accounts, advanced Bitcoin cold storage using collaborative self-custody, inheritance planning with both trust and entity accounts, tax loss harvesting, asset-backed loans, and more. Swan have helped over 100,000 clients since 2020, and if you're serious about acquiring and securing Bitcoin, I recommend Swan. You can meet the team at swan.com/WBD, which is SWAN.com/WBD. If you already self-custody Bitcoin, you know the deal with hardware wallets. Complex setups, clumsy interfaces, and a seed phrase that can be lost, stolen, or forgotten. BitKey fixes that. BitKey's self-custody built for real life. It gives you an intuitive, easy-to-use wallet with no seed phrase to sweat over. And it has a strong recovery system and built-in inheritance for long-term peace of mind. And BitKey's just had a massive upgrade. The new device now has a screen, so before you approve something, you can check it on the BitKey itself. The transaction, the address, or any account changes. It's a big difference. You're not just trusting what's on your phone, you're seeing it for yourself on the device. It's simple, secure self-custody without the stress. Go to bitkey.world today and use the code WBD to get 10% off the new BitKey. That's bitkey.world and use the code WBD. Wow. What a monologue. I've literally written like an entire page of questions here. And I want to go back to something you were talking about earlier with Venezuela. Because you said this is essentially like a battle of whether the future is going to be the petrodollar or the petro yuan. And that China potentially had like forewarning of this happening and did nothing about it. Same with Russia. What I can never understand is like why did they step down if that could have been advantageous to them, and who would have made them step down in that situation?
Because if you remember, I was doing live coverages of this at the time. As soon as Trump came into presidency, I said he is there for one very specific reason, to asset strip America and to reset the world order into multipolarity. If you look at Trump's funding, everyone talks about AIPAC and Israel, but if you look at just his direct funding, the number one contributor to the Trump administration was Elon Musk, who represents the technical industrial complex that requires military funding in order to continue to be a trillionaire on paper. Second was the Mellon banking dynasty family, the financial industrial complex. And number three was Mariam Edelstein, who represents Israel, who's a node of the military industrial complex. And so look at that order: technical, financial, military. But there was a hidden layer of financing that existed on top of that, which was what happened via later World Liberty Financial, which is UAE, and Jared Kushner managing a fund called Affinity Capital Partners. And Affinity Capital was funded to the tune of almost $5 billion, $2 billion of which came from Saudi Arabia. Trump worked for the Gulf countries while making promises to the technical industrial complex, financial industrial complex, and last, military industrial complex. And so what he had to do is he had to get the world believing that Israel, and again, this isn't Trump. Don't think I'm talking about 5D chess. This is transnational capital. Biden represents more of the neocon Zionist military industrial complex. Trump is a deal maker. He's not a neocon. He represents the financial industrial complex. The financial industrial complex partners with the Gulf sovereign wealth funds as their number one source of financing for all of their IPOs, deals, AI, robotics, everything. Where does Gulf get their money from? The petrodollar has died. Why? Because America is now an energy exporter. Yeah, it still has to import from Mexico and Canada, and it gets some of it from the Gulf. But all of the Gulf money comes from China, the largest manufacturing base in the world, that has set up 30% petro yuan, 70% petrodollar. And so what this has been is there's a slow hedging of the countries that propped up the petrodollar, transitioning to this multipolar world. Now, what does China want? China doesn't want to be world reserve currency because they know what world reserve currency means. World reserve currency means you have to have a twin deficit. You have to simultaneously import more goods than you export. That doesn't work for China. And you have to spend more than you bring in tax revenue. That also doesn't work for China because they got a public banking, community banking system, whereas the Federal Reserve is a private banking system that exports dollars globally. And so China doesn't want to be world reserve currency. So what they want is a shitload of gold in order to back up the value of a devalued currency with capital controls to keep out the barbarians. The Great Wall of China was built to keep out the barbarians. And in this case, the barbarians are the financial industrial complex. And so what we need to enter into here is a world where China proxies control both the petrodollar and petro-yuan. And when I say proxies, that's not, I'm just trying to simplify language. It's never as simple as that. But remember, the Gulf countries are monarchies that fund a sovereign wealth fund with their energy. That means that to the extent that they can be autonomous and sovereign, they are, with the exception of they rely upon alternative military. And so getting back to Venezuela, so I'll just close that loop there. And then you can understand Venezuela. So you have the East, you have the middle, and you have the West. China is the base, the manufacturing base of the world. Full stop. Transnational capital, technical industrial complex, military industrial complex. It's not going to change. Because America, what do? They're a privatized neoliberal, which means $69 trillion, $70 trillion of the American assets are foreign owned. When you own stock, you get voting rights. When you have voting rights, you install boards. When you have boards, the executives like Elon Musk work for you. And the FIC will give you bonds or equity and media manipulation to justify a narrative that pumps up your stock price as long as you comply with transnational capital. You want a $2 trillion IPO? You have to comply with our requirements. You know what I mean? And you're building in China, and then you can build some of those things in America, but the manufacturing base is still here. Then that fuels all the energy which is purchased via the Middle East, because Saudi only has 35 million population, and they have the largest reserves. America has 350 million to feed. So one way of getting this change is close the Strait of Hormuz, destroy the US military bases, and create a pricing event that pushes up the price of oil. And what was the Middle East doing prior to this? If you look at the largest beneficiary of LNG contracts, or one of them was alongside Cheniere Energy, was a company called Golden Pass. Golden Pass is 70% owned by Qatar Energy and 30% owned by Exxon. Who else got the Venezuelan refining contract? Well, we don't know, but Chevron and Exxon said, nah, it's a bit too much for us. We need higher oil prices. Close the Strait of Hormuz, create a pricing event, and we might come back in. But who invested in the exact type of oil refinement bases in Texas, in America, that could handle Venezuelan oil? It was a company called Minerva, which is a subsidiary 100% owned by Saudi Aramco. And that was all invested prior to this. And Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, did they really? Or did it require, or did they just announce that we will target any shipments that come through? And then Lloyd's of London said, we won't insure you. So Lloyd's of London said, we won't insure you. Now, Iran was targeting the Red Sea with the Houthis before, but shipments were still getting through and they were still getting insurance. Why did they not get insurance this time? Well, one could argue that it was because the danger was big. But right now, if you want a shipment via the Strait of Hormuz, you need the IRGC in Iran to say yes and give some assurance. You need America to say yes. And America is represented by private capital. And then you need Lloyd's of London to give you an insurance contract. And China was able to do that all the way through.
Do you think with the Lloyd's of London element of that it's nefarious? Or do you think they're just saying that the risk is too high and they can't do it?
Both can be true. You can have a strategic goal and you can say, we're not willing to do it. Why would we do it? And so on the lower level of Lloyd's of London, they're analysing on the need to know information they have. On the higher level, they're part of the financial industrial complex, and there's a higher level of executives that know what the market is doing. And the reason is, if you look at the market throughout the whole Iran war, it never signaled World War III. It never signaled. Oil prices went up, and it was always managed by TACO and narrative and Trump going up and down 83 times or whatever it was. But it never, if this was a genuine war like Iraq, or it was going to go to World War III, with Iran that is so significant, and the Strait of Hormuz and the Houthis that cover the Red Sea, this would have been stock market crash. It would have been gold going up at the same time as oil going up. And gold crashed into this. The highest levels of central bank in power were accumulating gold into a weaker gold price throughout this whole thing. They knew this wasn't World War III at the highest levels of power. They knew this was a transition to multipolarity and that they needed gold reserves instead of dollar reserves. And so they started selling their treasuries, which created the stress in the bond market which determined all of the TACO trades. Every time that the yield on the 30-year treasury and the yield on the 10-year treasury went to 4.5% or 5%, it was TACO Tuesday. Every time. And when price went above $120 on the 1-month futures oil, it was TACO. This was bounded escalation. It was managed escalation the whole way through. So they like the pricing event, but they didn't want to create demand destruction and crash the stock market because they had all the AI IPOs through. They needed liquidity for that. They could never get in the way of that liquidity. So this was about printing vast amounts of money, leading to a big print eventually with the regime change at the Fed, creating an AI bubble, but bounded escalation. And this concentrated wealth upwards. BlackRock's assets under administration went from 12 trillion to 14 trillion during this. Back to Venezuela. So Venezuela was a stand-down operation. The Venezuelan stock market reached new all-time highs. The Venezuelan stock market is not distributed. It is owned by a few banks and wealthy oligarchs. I couldn't prove this, but I'd make a speculative bet that Maduro has significant shares in the Venezuelan stock market, and so do a few banks in Venezuela. And I'd make a bet that the theatrical photo op was either coordinated by him, but definitely coordinated by the real power, the army in Venezuela, the real power structure. The ones that can control the guns, and the ones that can control the finance, the banks. And so either Maduro was given up or Maduro played along. And so what we're hitting right now is transnational capital is moving to multipolarity. You either play or you don't play. And if you don't play, you get taken out. The Ayatollah got taken out and replaced by his son. Maduro is in prison, either theatrical or, and both of those can be either theatrical or they wouldn't play along. Because transnational capital is able to rent as a for-rent militia, the US military industrial complex, to get its resources. So why did they step down? So what I said right at the beginning, let's go back to Trump. I said right at the beginning, Trump, if you go back and I documented the whole thing, I said Trump is going to win over Biden because he's been chosen to take America to war with Iran. I said that during the Biden administration. Now, most people were thinking that on the perspective of the plausible deniability narrative, which is Israel. So what did Trump do? And again, please don't think that Trump's in charge. The reason that Trump said 89 times that the deal's done is because Trump doesn't know when the deal's going to be done. He's being told by the real negotiators. And the real negotiators are not the front ones, are J.D. Vance and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. On his personal side is Jared Kushner. That's who manages the golf money that Trump gets rich from. But it is transnational capital, and he gets told. And so does Israel. People think Israel rules the world. Israel is a node of the military-industrial complex. Netanyahu is middle management. Trump and Netanyahu get to pretend and play we rule the world while they get rich from managing communications with the public from real power, which is Fick, Mick, and Tick. And they're the shareholders. And so Venezuela stepped down because it was agreed that in a multipolar world, private corporate interest, Fick, will dominate the Western Hemisphere. And Fick says, but we've got to compensate the military industrial complex. For a century, we've made so much money out of the war between Iran and Israel. And if that narrative, death to America, death to Israel, goes away, and now the proxies are integrated with local armies, and you see how that works. Did you see the rebranding of the president of Syria? One
No, I
minute
didn't
he
see
had
that.
a big beard saying that he's killing people for an Islamic state called ISIS. And next he works for Turkey and the Gulf countries and he shaves his beard and he's in the White House with perfume, with Trump perfume. That tells you everything you need to know. It's all theatrics. The whole narrative that you've been sold is to justify military profits to prop up the Ponzi scheme. And so if the proxies are going to be integrated and Iran signs a deal with America, then what's Israel going to do? What's the MIC going to do? How do they make their profits? Well, the justification, so we need to regime change, which is what I believe comes next. Regime change Netanyahu. And then we use our network of podcasters like Candace Owen, Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, in order to tell the truth about Israel, but don't tell them that they work for our US military. So let's release some Epstein files. You can see that it's a Mossad op, but we won't say Mossad, CIA, MI6 work for transnational capital and military powers. So here's what we do. Let's work through Trump's policies. First thing he did, Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. Okay, let's give Palantir and XAI all the data to build a police and surveillance state. Pretend we're trying to pay off the deficit, which is impossible because that completely creates a depression and a recession. If you pay down the debt, that's a depression. That is the money supply. That's the M2 money supply. Are you going to pay down the M2 money supply? So Elon says, we're going to pay down the national debt. We're going to take on corruption. MAGA, 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 MAGA. We're going to shut down USAID, which propped up all the covert operations in the Middle East. We're going to expose the deep state. We're going to drain the swamp. So what did Department of Government Efficiency? The deficit is at record levels. The debt is at record levels. And Palantir and XAI have all the data in private corporate interest in the highest performing stock of the year, Palantir, which is effectively your police and surveillance state, integrated into your social credit score, which is XAI, integrated into stable coins, which is what David Sachs put together. David Sachs, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, PayPal mafia from South Africa that suddenly are now meant to be the richest people making up the most. Oh, right. Okay. So we're privatizing all the data and giving it to them to build a social credit core, stablecoin, and police and surveillance state powered by AI with data centers that literally are going to be powered by more energy than we have. That's a big job. Remember, all of America's growth came from data center build out. America would have been in a recession with zero growth if it wasn't for building data centers for AI and this energy crisis. Now, that doesn't benefit Americans. Remember, you got to get the narrative right. That benefits a few companies. That's transnational capital. $70 trillion owned by global, managed by BlackRock. 10% of the stock market is controlled by 92%. That's concentration of wealth. You pay the bill, you get the inflation, but the asset owners get all the benefit. Right? That's how the system is set up. Concentration of wealth, wealth extraction, asset stripping. So he did DOGE. Then what did he do? Next one was tariffs. Tariffs, when I went on the live, I said tariffs will do three things. The first thing it will do is it will make small to medium-sized businesses in America bankrupt because America is an importer. And an importer means that you pay the tariff. China's not paying the tariff. American small business is paying the tariff. And you can see that via the tax rebates. So it was American small business that are applying for all the rebates in the court case right now. So you create more bankruptcies, just like COVID, in the local small business, concentrate wealth upwards into the large multinational corporation. They can negotiate with the Trump administration and China to offset all of their tariffs. So they get free rides, small business pays a tariff in America. What about the export-dependent countries like Taiwan, like Japan, like India, like Vietnam? Well, firstly, their small businesses go bankrupt, the large ones offset, and they renegotiate with China. So you push everyone into China because China's their most important partner. America is, only purchasing like 15% of China's exports. 85% is the other country. America's only 25% of the world GDP and is propped up by debt. And it's only the top 10% of Americans that are facilitating 50% of all the consumption in America now. The rest are broke. Collateralized debt obligations to the highest degree, living in poverty conditions that rival, the most poverty-struck country in the world for a massive chunk of America, like complete outcasts of the system, collateralized debt obligations. But it drove everyone to BRICS. And so everyone renegotiated all of their contracts, and we entered into a multipolar world where everyone hedged. All the countries that aren't involved, they said, America's no longer a reliable partner. I need to negotiate eastwards with my stable partners. China, BRICS, Russia, Gulf countries where the energy comes from. So he reset the world order. And that was called Dollar Liberation Day. I called it, Trump has liberated the world from the dollar, from the petrodollar.
Why do they want to become, why did the cabal, whoever's in charge, want America to not be the hegemon anymore? Is it because the burden of being the hegemon's too high?
Yeah, come back to that question. So I'll finish off the Trump policies, 2 more policies. Then we'll go back to Venezuela. Then we'll answer that question.
Okay.
Because I don't want to leave it open. The third thing Trump did was destroy the reputation of America in the covert operations. Now, this one's really easy because MAGA-tards and Q-tards in the CIA PSYOP, they kind of think we're making America great again. We're exposing the deep state. Trump's releasing the JFK files. And it was the military-industrial complex in Israel that killed JFK, in order to get the illegal nuclear bomb that they stole, that Israel still has right now, in order to destabilize the Middle East, that they said Iran's got. It was Israel that had it, and they said Iran's got it. Anyway. But by the way, sorry, one part aside, I will say this. The largest nuclear Bitcoin miner in the world is Iran.
Huh.
Iran, you think is El Salvador. All of the crypto was seized, all of the stable coins were seized. But Iran and its nuclear energy is by far and away, by my estimation, I can't prove it categorically, but there's a few data points we could go through later that suggests it's the largest sovereign Bitcoin miner, nuclear powered in the world.
See, I assumed that Iran were mining Bitcoin. I didn't realize it would be at that sort of size scale.
Well, during the 12-day war, when American B-52 bombers, you look at the hash power during that time, 2 things happened simultaneously. One is Iran was moving its highly enriched uranium because it knew the target was coming because it had already been told. And that was a very theatrical war. That's an example of a theatrical war. And at the same time, there was energy in the Texas grid went down. And we had this massive contraction at the exact same time of Bitcoin hash power. When Iran was moving all of their highly enriched uranium, and apparently there was a electrical grid outage in Texas where 40% of the public Bitcoin miners are. 40% of the hash power managed by a few public. Anyway, during that moment, there was a massive crash in hash power, and then afterwards it came back online again. I don't know whether that's exactly true, but it's obvious. It's obvious that Iran is mining Bitcoin and they've got a nuclear program, civilian, energy program. So why wouldn't you? Right. Third policy was Epstein files. That destroyed the reputation and destroyed the radical Zionist neocons in America, the evangelical Christians that were propping up a lot of this campaign financing in AIPAC. And it revealed many of the covert operations. And it kind of distracted all of us into understanding how the Peter Thiel networks work. We got all the big reveals around the Epstein infiltrations, trying to take on Bitcoin, all that stuff that we were there. But that severely weakened the reputation of America and led to the narrative of what was the best marketing I've ever seen from Iran. And I'm sure you watched the Lego videos of Iran taking on the Epstein class.
Mm-hmm.
Iran taking on the Epstein class. Prior to that, the majority of Americans probably would have thought that Iran was some radical Islamist terrorist chopping off a head with ISIS videos. And now you had Americans wishing that Iran defeats America so that they can take on the Epstein class and take out Israel. Americans, after this exercise, Epstein files, closure of Strait of Hormuz, and the marketing campaign from Iran, you had Americans that in their mind, Iran was the hero. In the youth's mind, the same youth that know exactly what Israel is and are now part of an operation to say it wasn't us, it was just them, right? So now, when I was first talking about Israel on October the 7th and around about then, I was getting hate from Americans. Like, when I was saying this is a false flag operation, and by the way, none of that, I won't say it on YouTube, but none of the things you said happened. And this is a classic Mossad false flag op. The footage, all the stuff, classic Mossad ops, false flags. And there was a hostage-taking operation, just like the 1979 revolution. And that revolution, if you look at it, Iran-Contra affair, was a partnership between MI6, British, French intelligence, Israeli intelligence in the Iran-Contra affair, America, and Iran. And so when the Shah was replaced with the Ayatollah, there's significant evidence in declassified documents that this was a MIC operation to justify military profits. And a peaceful Iran is not a good thing. A boogie monster Iran is what the military needs. So anyway, you had the rebranding and then the closure of the Strait of Hormuz created the energy pricing event that reset the order again and led to America's Suez Canal moment. 1956, the British Empire, after handing over to the Federal Reserve System, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, all of that history, IMF, World Bank, started going through decolonization moment after they could not defend the Suez Canal from Egypt. Egypt privatized it. Nasser had a pan-Arab uprising. And then the world had to transition to an America-dominated empire. But the British Empire was a vassal from there. The moment was when the British tried to defend the Suez Canal from Egypt and couldn't defend it, and the British Navy could no longer defend the waters. The same has just happened with the Strait of Hormuz. And Trump makes a lot of money from it. Don't believe the forward-facing narrative. Trump is doing for Fick, Mick, and Tick what they want. And what they want, the Mick are kind of like addicted to the old world of the petrodollar and propping everything up by war. But Mick is subordinate to Fick. Mick wanted to make up for lost profits because Fick was saying, we're now partnered with the Gulf countries and they want regional stability. And they're partnered, they're funded by China. And China normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's a problem. Now, Iran and Saudi Arabia are publicly saying, and Saudi Arabia, UAE joined BRICS, Iran joined BRICS, Egypt joined BRICS, Ethiopia joined BRICS. And Saudi said, we'll do the holdout clause. Firstly, we'll price 30% in petro yuan, and we'll be an observer on BRICS, and we'll say we're normalized with Israel on one condition: if Palestine is free and Palestine has a state. And so UAE and Saudi started playing good cop and bad cop. UAE started saying, well, we'll normalize and acquire as many Israeli assets, because joining Abraham Accords means you get to acquire Israeli assets. Foreign direct investment, you get to own it. Everyone else thinks, oh, they're bitches of Israel. No, UAE is acquiring the military-industrial complex. UAE is providing the capital for AI, the new cybersecurity, the new control grid. And so is, but Saudi isn't. And so make UAE look really bad, make Saudi look really good with the holdout. But meanwhile, China has all the leverage over Mick, Fick, and Tick. So get China to negotiate, and we'll be those intermediary plays. Now all we need is to have a deal between Iran and America. How do you achieve that without breaking the whole model and ending up in absolute chaos across the Middle East? Because Iran is a very powerful military. And America knew, because the CIA documents had already said, Tulsi Gabbard had already said. So firstly, CIA Tulsi Gabbard said, we don't think Iran has nuclear weapons, publicly in Congress, in Senate hearing. She also knew, or the scenario planning knew, that if you attack Iran, the Strait of Hormuz would be closed. They knew that. And they knew that that would lead to Iran targeting US bases across the Gulf countries. Could it be that that's what they wanted? Could it be that Iran, China, and the Gulf countries said, okay, Iran, you destroy all the US bases. We've invested in our alternative path in America to control part of the LNG and oil refinement infrastructure. Israel will eliminate anyone within IRGC that's not on board with this plan. And America will destroy infrastructure that requires Iran to get a $300 billion rebuild contract funded by China Belt and Road Initiative, the Gulf Cooperation Council Sovereign Wealth Funds, and the financial industrial complex. How do we get investment in Iran, the lifting of sanctions, the ability to price that oil in alternative petro yuan, and America retreat while still looking strong? Well, we draft a theatrical Hollywood movie, and we create the Suez Canal moment. But there's three conditions we need. The condition is the IRGC needs to remain intact, but they need to be on board with this plan. Anyone that's not on board with this plan, there you go. So launch a war. Every time they retaliate, do internal regime change. And then you won't have to have external regime change. And remember, prior to this, there was regime change prior to this operation. Remember the helicopter that fell down, that took out the regime change I personally believe that this was inside jobs from the highest factions of power. But they'll never admit that, and we'll never get the evidence of it because it would create carnage across Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Netanyahu, you negotiate your own personal survival. You're gone. Your regime changed. The next leader of Israel is going to be aligned with the Palestinian state covertly, but overtly will accept funding from Gulf Cooperation Council, Abraham Accords. You privatize as many assets, do as many IPOs as possible, and the Gulf countries will buy them. Saudi Arabia says there has to be a Palestinian state. Who's going to fund the rebuild of Gaza? The Gulf countries are. Who's going to build it? China is. And Israel, the Israeli oligarchs need compensating. The military-industrial complex needs compensating. What can we give them? I tell you what, let's shrink America into a regional power. Let's give them Central and South America and Europe. Putin will continue to be Hitler in the eyes of the Europeans, and we'll give you another $3 trillion, we'll give you another $1 trillion of war profiteering. Trump will pretend that he's taking on NATO. NATO will increase their budget to 5%. The Europeans will think that we'll create divide and conquer between the Americans and Europeans. The Europeans will become more woke, more renewable energy. We'll create an energy crisis. We'll make them look like, we'll create an immigration crisis. We'll divide and conquer there. We'll get Keir Starmer to implement digital ID, Palantir technology, dividing, now everyone using the internet needs to verify their identity. We'll do pre-crime arrests. We'll create that divide and conquer there. We'll radicalize the Brits into a white nationalist movement. We'll do all that type of stuff. And we'll create an energy crisis where Europe needs to buy all of their renewable energy. Where do you get your windmills from? Where do you get your manufacturing base from?
China.
You destroy the German manufacturing base and you get them to buy it from China. But defense and military has to come from America. So they started building new military bases. They turned Volkswagen into a new military base, and we started to get a wave of German, European military IPOs. So you get them energy dependent on you split them there. You break the euro dollar, you break the petrodollar. We also need to break the Japan carry trade. So Japan started increasing rates for the first time. And now you've completely reset, that world order. And so what are they doing? They're saying American private corporate interests via the debt-based Ponzi scheme at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, literally right now, Kevin Warsh is doing his first meeting today, Wednesday. What did we have this week? We had G7 meeting where Trump, for the first time, said, Israel, why are you killing so many civilians in Lebanon? Unheard of. America's never admitted that. Like, literally, this is close to admitting they do genocide. Saying you don't need to kill civilians every time you target Hezbollah. That's never happened in American history. America admitting that they're genocidal by their military, but doing it through plausible deniability and saying, Israel, you did that. Right? That's breaking the relationship to a degree we've never seen before.
Yeah.
So on Monday in the G7 meeting, they do that. On Tuesday, the Bank of Japan increased rates. Today, Kevin Warsh's meeting. Nobody knows, is Kevin going to leave? I think they'll leave rates unchanged today. But at the next one, if he raises rates or lowers rates, it radically changes the stock market and the bond market. And this is literally the Fed, which is owned by the banks, are in charge of the future of America right now to the degree we've never seen before. And they're saying it's the opposite. They're saying Trump is taking on the Fed. He's creating stable coins. Now, Genius Act gave the banks the ability to use their reserves in order to back stable coins and get a yield advantage. And anyone that wants to play in that game needs to get a bank charter. So the stable coin is just the technical programmable money. It's not taking on the Fed. The Fed is still in charge of the US economy, all markets right now, massive concentration of power into the financial industrial complex. Tomorrow we got Bank of England, and on Friday we're going to be signing the memorandum of understanding between Iran and US. So this week is pretty big. It's a big week to see where all of this stuff goes. But all this to say, if you're BlackRock and you're managing a portfolio, you'd want your renewable energy stocks to perform. You'd want your energy stocks to perform. You'd want your finance stocks to perform, your military stocks to perform, your technical stocks to perform, and you'd manage a portfolio. And if you're managing a portfolio and you're the number one primary shareholder in all of them, and you've got Aladdin Technology, which manages $25 trillion of capital for every sovereign wealth fund, every central bank, every treasury, not all, everyone, the major ones, all the pension funds. And they're all doing a scenario planning of what happens when you close the Strait of Hormuz? How should I allocate my capital? And then BlackRock's Aladdin says, here's how you scenario plan that with their AI algorithm with the biggest amount of data. You control capital and you've got all the ETF flows. You can just say, right, ETF flows out of Bitcoin into AI. ETF flows out of here into like the ETF flows. The currency was. I remember Scott Bessent admitted that he destroyed the Iranian currency, and Mossad were in there, and Mossad were the ones that were killing the Iranians, so that they could blame it on IRGC. And if you put Mossad against IRGC, people are going to die. Come on, like this is a militarized government that's dealing with CIA, MI6, and Mossad. And so you had that whole narrative of 45,000 people dying. These were all covert operations. And I believe it led to the inside job of the internal regime change. I'll never get confirmation and everyone will be offended by that. But it is what it is. I think when you follow the money, it makes sense. So the Western Hemisphere is now privatized, collateralized, securitized, and tokenized. Every crisis concentrates wealth higher. All the values in the stock market, the bond vigilantes have the American government held hostage. And China has the key to all of the different levers. Now, if you're China, you know that you can't penetrate China. What are you going to do? You're going to negotiate with China. And if you're negotiating with China and you're also negotiating with the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds, what happens with BlackRock? There was a new board member that was installed on BlackRock, which is the CEO of Saudi Aramco, which is Saudi. So now China owns a chunk of the assets. The Gulf funds own a chunk of the assets. And now they're getting voting seats and board seats on BlackRock. Now you have to consider what transnational capital wants. So if you know that America is getting into this extreme divide and conquer political polarization, you've got suicide rates at all-time high, the 10th largest cause of death in America. You've got drug addiction at all-time high. You've got wealth inequality at extremes that are causing extreme polarization. You've got a desire to move to more leftist ideology and more communistic way, more socialistic way of redistributing wealth away from elites. You've got the Epstein class that everyone kind of understands how this shit works. You've got a corrupt government. You've got birth rates at their lowest. Literally, the West is going extinct in terms of their current birth rates over the decades ahead. Then what do? You take the only asset that you care about in America, the liquidity of the stock market and the bond market and Wall Street, and you manage capital outflows. And so BlackRock started, if you look at their ETFs, over 50% of the ETFs are invested in emerging markets now. That was 25% before. So BlackRock is asset stripping the West through the financial industrial complex, pumping fiscal dominance, dumping debt on the American people at negative real returns, and then pumping it all into the stock market through political corruption, controlling of Senate, Congress, deep state bribing of judicial, pumping the stock market up to its all-time highs and using its industries like military to rent it out. And then what happens? Rather than saying you must come on the petrodollar, they're saying you get an FX swap line, you get to create dollars. They're also saying that you must buy and we must build data centers and sell military equipment, but this time for defense. So you're going to buy it from China. And so what they're building is MIC, FIX, and TIX in a multipolar world. The key nodes across the world are now signing their own defense contracts. And so if you know that the dollar is no longer your tool, you say, if I've got another 10, 20 years of this, I'm going to maximize what I can, and I'm going to buy into a multipolar world. And then we get to charge fees off all the alternative MIC, TIX, and FIX. And we get to integrate with China. Trump, you go make sure that we get all our resources and we set an alternative to World War III. One alternative to World War III is China says, right, you have Venezuela, Central and South America. Russia gets Ukraine. We get Taiwan, sorry. And what happened after the meeting in Beijing? Xi Jinping just said, our red line is Taiwan. Trump said, don't touch Taiwan. And prior to that, cancelled a $13 billion defense contract between America and Taiwan. So they split the world up. This is good. This is very good. Once you understand this, we're not going to World War III by every metric that I can measure. As an alternative to World War III, they said shrink America into a regional power, vassalize the entire West into private corporate interest. The Middle East becomes West Asia, funded by China. We build a global technocratic surveillance police and state with China and the technical industrial complex. And West Asia can manage the petro-yuan versus a petrodollar. And the minute we want to rug pull, the PBOC and the Federal Reserve can rug pull the system in a second if they wanted to. But we'd rather have a managed transition.
You say this is good, and obviously avoiding World War III is good, but it sounds like what the world you're laying out is just a AI surveillance panopticon, which also sounds terrible. Is it just the lesser of two evils, essentially?
It's good because I think World War III would have been nuclear and it would have ended the world. The alternative to that is we recognize the world as it is, which is the US empire as being in a managed decline. Multipolarity means that those who are on the wrong side of US bombs, for the first time, may actually get to build a country. This could be for Africa for the first time in a millennia, where they may actually be able to partner with China and use their resources. This is the end of the covert forever war, deep state US bombs. For many people in the world, this is a life that they could never imagine is possible. They were on the wrong side of US bombs, and you were on the wrong side of the propaganda. We were on the wrong side of the propaganda. The opportunity to renegotiate into a Bitcoin strategic reserve, a China Belt and Road Initiative funding, Gulf funding, or IMF funding in a multipolar world gives the right leaders the opportunity to kind of do what Egypt did. Egypt was an IMF vassal. Mm-hmm. It then said, we will not ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. IMF, you wanted us to take the $18 billion to put all the Palestinians in the Sinai desert. And we could say no, only for one reason, because we took China money and we took Gulf money and we hedged our bets. And guess what? We've got a military. And our military has partnered with Turkey, a manufacturing base, and a nuclear power, Pakistan, and a financial power, Saudi Arabia, and partnered with China. This is decolonization. And some countries will get this negotiation very wrong and just become another subordinate to China. But others will play off those forces and create prosperity where poverty was inbuilt into their economy because their dictator was installed by American covert operations to take all of their resources and put it into an iPhone so that it could be consumed by American collateralized debt obligations on debt and credit cards. I think multipolarity gives a chance to change. And some countries will get it very wrong and stay in the same position. Others will get it right. We also get to recognize the real battle. The real battle is not the Muslims versus the Jews versus the Christians. It's not America versus the Europeans. It's not communism versus capitalism. It's not the radical left versus the far right. It's not, any of those things. It's not Republicans versus Democrats. It's not Keir Starmer versus Nigel Farage and Reform Party. They're all a different flavor of the same agenda that are a part of the same systemic system. We get to change the system if we want. Because once we recognize what is the source of all this power, it is the Bank for International Settlements, PBOC, the Federal Reserve, and the central banking cabal. That's the Ponzi scheme. Strategic tension and with it. What else is the new? What could take down the financial industrial complex and the military industrial complex? Interestingly, algorithms and the technical industrial complex. Imagine if all of us talking to ChatGPT was actually just our new Epstein bribery network. Probably could be, feasible that it could be. What if us all talking on X was us building our social credit score? What if this movement towards to money and stable coins and CBDCs was programmable money? What if all of that was about to be plugged together and that police and surveillance state is being built and it's a global thing? Then we know that the centralization of chips, energy, data centers, the manufacturing, the technology, the code is actually our enemy if we want to resist. Now, we need a level of practicality, just like a Bitcoiner still needs a bank account and fiat currency. But they understand they're getting their mix right of utilizing the system and opting out of the system and building their sovereign strategy. And sometimes you have to use Wall Street vehicles to get there. Sometimes you do these things, but that friction of a spectrum of sovereignty is available to you if you understand what's really going on. The same as in AI. What if we built decentralized AI? And no, I'm not talking about shitcoinery and tokens and all that stuff. But what if we ended up in a situation where this power structure and we're able to have our distributed supercomputers and we're able to install our own LLMs. And, most people are building on Chinese open source at the moment.
Yep.
But what if we had an architecture of resistance? What if we knew that this global control grid also has many imperfections and we could resist? How do you fight back against peak centralization? Well, you build decentralized communities, a system of nodes, right? What if you build your own community nodes? You built your own sovereign LLMs, your own sovereign money. You built your own financial independence in your family. You actually start focusing on your own health supply chains. You start building parallel communities in your communities, and you start figuring out how to build your own connected supply chains. And that's the opportunity. That's where we need to be working. Because the antithesis of centralization is decentralization. So we need to decentralize money, we need to decentralize artificial intelligence, and we need to decentralize control grids through decentralized communities. If you fund your farmer, they want your farmer bankrupt because they want you having artificial food that's manufactured in some technical industrial complex where your protein is the World Economic Forum tell you everything they want to do. And by the way, if you want to know what they want to do to the world, what it could look like, look at what they rebuild in Gaza. The reason they destroyed Lebanon, the reason they destroyed Gaza is because look at the Gaza rebuild plan. It is a technocratic, tokenized, World Economic Forum, data center enabled, Palantir powered, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, David Sachs, Orwellian nightmare with a Trump Tower based upon funding from, affinity partners and Kushner Capital and Gulf countries. What they rebuild in Gaza is what they would like to do everywhere if they can. And so we need to resist against the sovereign wealth funds. How do you do that? You try to build sovereign countries. Now we don't have the degree that we can, but there is a resistance. What is El Salvador is a captured country. Face it, dollarization means you're owned by the Fed, and IMF debt means you're owned by the IMF. I think they still have captured. But there is a brink of a model of building a Bitcoin strategic reserve fund that may, they didn't do, I went to try and help them build the volcano bond. I'll tell you this, I got chased out by the IMF. That country is still IMF dominated. But can those resistance, can Gaza build a sovereign strategy, just like Singapore, that allows it to free itself from the colonizers? That's an interesting question. We get to see that on a global stage. So as tragic as it is, if you read a book like Tragedy and Hope, we are in one of the most tragic times in history with one of the most hopeful times in history. And we get to live through that.
Do you want to pay less in taxes and stack more Bitcoin? Of course you do. Well, by mining Bitcoin with Blockware, you can. Under Section 168K of the US tax code, Bitcoin mining servers qualify for 100% bonus depreciation. This means every dollar you spend on miners can directly offset your income in a single year. And it's true for both business owners and W-2 earners. So if you have $100,000 in ordinary income, you can purchase $100,000 in miners and potentially offset your tax liability entirely. Blockware's mining as a service does all the heavy lifting. They secure the rigs, they source the low-cost power, and they handle all the day-to-day maintenance. So you get to stack Bitcoin every single day while drastically shrinking your tax bill. Get started today at blockwaresolutions.com/WBD and use code WBD for $100 off your first miner. That's blockwaresolutions.com/WBD. If you hold Bitcoin for long enough, there's probably going to come a time when you need some dollars. Maybe it's for a business expense, a tax bill, a property purchase, but whatever it is, you might not want to sell your Bitcoin. That's where Ledn comes in. Ledn lets you borrow against your Bitcoin so you can access cash without selling your stack. They've originated over $10 billion of loans since 2018, and they've operated through multiple Bitcoin cycles. And Ledn has now introduced new tiered rates, so there's no negotiation, no guesswork, it's just the larger the loan, the lower the rate, and you can see all the rates up front before you apply. The important part for me, though, is the custody. With Ledn's custodied loans, your Bitcoin collateral is never lent out to generate interest. You also get all the tools to properly manage the loan, including LTV alerts, auto top-ups, and the ability to repay whenever you want with no penalties. I've used Ledn myself. The application's taken me less than 15 minutes, and you get dollars in your account within hours. So you don't need to choose between getting liquidity and sticking to your long-term Bitcoin plan. With Ledn, you can do both. Check your rate using the loan calculator at ledn.io and use the code WBD for 0.25% off your first loan. That's ledn.io and use the code WBD. The thing that keeps me up at night with Bitcoin cold storage isn't Bitcoin failing, it's my setup failing. And this is where AnchorWatch comes in. With AnchorWatch, your Bitcoin's insured with your own A+ rated Lloyd's of London insurance policy. And all Bitcoin's held in their time-locked multi-sig vaults. So you have the peace of mind knowing your Bitcoin's insured while not giving up custody. So whether you're worried about inheritance planning, rent attacks, natural disasters, or just your own silly mistakes, you're protected by AnchorWatch. Rates for fully insured custody start as low as 0.55% and are available for individual and commercial customers in the US. You can speak to AnchorWatch for a quote, and for more details about your security options and coverage, visit anchorwatch.com today. That's anchorwatch.com. It's certainly the most interesting time. I do definitely want to get onto the Bitcoin stuff, but just quickly before, I had a question around like America giving up its hegemonic status, and I don't 100% understand why they would do that. Is it because they've realized that sort of the debt levels are totally unsustainable and it actually becomes a burden rather than a gift to be the hegemon?
So if you look at the British Empire, once it accepted that it was no longer the empire, it started transferring all of its assets over to America and engineered war and depressions in order to facilitate it. So the Bank of England just became a node. The Federal Reserve, with the manufacturing base of the US military-industrial complex, became the New World Order, and that required IMF and World Bank. America's not a sovereign state. You can rent and purchase congressmen, Senate people through lobbies. American politics is a clown show of 4-year and 2-year games to prop up the profits of 3-month reporting cycles of corporate America. And it's foreign owned. Transnational capital owns America. America is not a sovereign country. Britain's not a sovereign country. Germany's not a sovereign country. The European Union. You can see that it's obvious. They're not acting in the national interest because they can't. Politics is an extraction game. You build your contacts, you extract as much wealth as you can, and you get to insider trade. That's the game of politics. Why do you think all these tycoons of industry get into politics? Like Howard Lutnick, an investment banker connected to the Israeli Epstein networks. Do you think he's doing civil service? No, he's extracting wealth for his personal family. So he put his son in charge of Cantor's, seeing how he could penetrate the Bitcoin community with Trump did the same. He put his sons in charge, see how he could penetrate the Bitcoin community. Steve Witkoff did the same. Then they created a money laundering organization called World Liberty Financial, took UAE bribes, started selling pardons to CZ and others, started laundering money into Binance, started taking bribes for political favors so that they could personally enrich their family trusts. Steve Witkoff, do you think he knows? He's a real estate guy that's negotiating as the envoy for the Middle East. What happens? Binance launches a stablecoin, $2 billion of liquidity from UAE goes into that stablecoin. Binance then gets a license in UAE. America gets to take over the compliance department. They get 300 million accounts. Israel gets to shut down the accounts of Palestinians, Lebanese, and Syrians in Binance by order from Israel. America gets the data, and CZ gets 4 months and a presidential pardon.
It's
just
deal.
Politics, it's just corruption. So America is not a sovereign country. So when the British Empire needed to transition because they bankrupted, what did the Bank of England do? The Bank of England, the British East India Company, and the UK government were the three forces of the British Empire. The British East India Company was the privatization of war and all the resources you can steal. The Bank of England was the mechanism for profiting from all the debt, and the government is the piggy bank. Eventually, all the assets end up privatized and in the British East India Company, and the Bank of England bankrupts the UK government. So rather than allowing this to fail, you asset strip Britain for all you can, you privatize everything, and you engineer wars and depressions to set up the next empire. You transfer everything to the Federal Reserve, all the assets are over there. Now, at the end of this one, you're extracting all the wealth you can from Americans, you load it up with all the debt, you privatize all of the assets, and then you build into the next world order, which is you either go to war with China and end up in nuclear war, or you build a multipolar world. So you sit down and you negotiate and you split the world up and you say, how can I profit from this? How can I maximize it? Well, why don't I build AI data centers across the world? Why don't I leverage the assets of America to slowly start managing capital outflows? And where's the next phase of growth? All the countries that got data centers and had energy and commodities, their stock markets outperformed the S&P throughout this whole thing. Their currencies outperformed the dollar throughout this whole thing. That means you're managing the next phase of growth. You're also asking, if we unemploy everybody and the birth rates are sinking, who's going to buy all this shit? If all the Americans are broke and all the Europeans are broke and they're all maxed out on their credit card, who's still having babies to buy this stuff? All right, well, I'll tell you what. We'll put the West on a universal basic income, just enough so that they can prop up the profits of the companies that they're buying from. We keep the system alive. And then we invest into the countries that have still got the birth rates that can be the future consumers that China can help build their economies. Who's that? Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. They're the birth rates. They're the consumers. So let's invest in growth there. And let's manage a portfolio. I'll maximize my profits of everything I can extract from the West. And then I'll build out there for the next growth cycle. Remember, politicians work off a 2-year election cycle in the case of America, and 4 years where they have to get funding from private corporate interest. So they have 2 years to serve the interest of their lobbies while pretending they're working for the people. If they can successfully, Trump is becoming, that asset is being expired. Netanyahu is being expired. You know, he's no longer a useful asset. For as long as he has the cult that believe he's doing it for Americans, while he serves transnational capital, he's a useful asset. So he's being expired. So then you set up the next game. JD Vance, you get the Democrat side, you start the cycle again. It's just a 2-year, 4-year cycle. But transnational capital has a multi-decade strategy. This is the legacy families. In the case of the American empire, it was, the Morgans and the Rockefellers. In the case of the British and Europe side, it was, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs in Germany, and the European families. Now you've got they exited all their positions into private family trusts in Cayman Island, in Isle of Man, and all the different places. And now they've all got their position of BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And then the investment requires bigger money. It requires the sovereign wealth funds. The sovereign wealth funds, they're harder to penetrate because they kept their energy. So now we need to co-opt Iran. How do we open up Iran? How do we negotiate with China? How do we slowly dismantle the petrodollar in a managed transition rather than a situation that crashes our markets? And then you get a communist uprising or socialist uprising in America. And now the whole system is exposed to the dollar. If you're just exposed to the dollar and the American capital markets, and you see that place going extinct, going more violent, and you see the potential of a socialist communist uprising, that means you give all the power and the assets. That's what Putin did. Putin took on the oligarchs and said, you ain't privatizing our energy or our resources. That's what China did after the century of humiliation. They said, we're not opening up our markets to you. We're nationalizing our central bank. We're turning all of our banks into state central banks, and we're having capital and controls to keep you out. If America did that, that would destroy the entire Mick, Fick, and Tick. And maybe they need to make sure that that doesn't happen. And that's what multipolarity is, because there's no natural European empire to hand it over to. The West has already been asset stripped for everything. There's no one left. There's nothing left. And so you deploy your assets globally and you manage a portfolio. And you make sure that China can still have a manufacturing base that gives you the cheaper cost and the cheaper labor. And you got your access to capital from Gulf countries. And you make transaction fees into multipolarity. So what do? You try and centralize Bitcoin next.
Okay. So do you think that's actually happening? Because Bitcoin seems positioned very well for the move to a multipolar world. And I think one of the things that we saw in Iran that was very interesting is them taking insurance payments essentially to cross the strait in Bitcoin. They first tried in stablecoins got frozen, and Bitcoin was really the only option. Do you think this is going to play a bigger role going forward?
Yes, is the answer to that, which is why Wall Street wants your Bitcoin. And they want to make you sell your Bitcoin, custody your Bitcoin, or borrow against your Bitcoin, or gambling in shitcoins. They want you levered up. They want you with your Bitcoin in collateral for them. They want Coinbase to own the Bitcoin. They want Fidelity to own the Bitcoin. And they want you to have a share instead of Bitcoin. And so what you do in that situation is you say, right, how much Bitcoin can we get? Because if we're transitioning to multipolarity, and remember, this isn't as centralized. People think there's a few people at the top controlling it. This is a ruthless game, like a mafia, right? The mafia, they have people that want to be the boss. They make you kill people in order to prove that you're worthy of being in the club. And then they put you in a blackmail and compromise network the higher you want to go. That's what the Epstein files was. And there's thousands of Epsteins, by the way. This isn't just one operation. Pedophilia, sex trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, that's what funds the deep state. The reason it still exists is not because any government's taking it on. The CIA, Mossad, and MI6 and Five Eyes, they fund their black op operations through sex trafficking, weapons trafficking, humans trafficking, and blackmail and blackmail operations. No one's taking on the drug cartels. That is the government. They work with the government. They work with the intelligence apparatus. and private corporate sector makes lots of money out of those transactions. So anyway, what do you do? Well, Bitcoin could be a great negotiation tactic, a great leverage. So let's do Operation Choke Point 2.0. Let's install a couple of operatives. If you didn't follow Celsius, Celsius, Alex Majinsky, an ex-IDF soldier from Ukraine, that was involved in the crimes against Lebanon that we're witnessing right now, back in when Hezbollah first came to be. His partner was Daniel Leone. Daniel Leone currently works in an AI startup with the Prime Minister's Office of Israel after not going to prison. His wife was the head of propaganda for the IDF, and she was the VP head of loans for Celsius. And she was the person that engaged in the propaganda on October the 7th with the Wall Street Journal in order to push out a story that the United Nations that was providing the food for the Palestinians UNRWA was connected to the October the 7th attack, so that they could launch the starvation campaign and famine campaign on the Palestinians. She was the VP of loans at Celsius. One of the hacks was a company called Bancor DAO. Bancor DAO, the primary shareholders were the niece and nephew of Benjamin Netanyahu. One of the reasons that Celsius fell on top of all the fraud, extraction, and crimes of Alex Majinsky that he's now serving 12 years for was because they were connected to the network that took down Terra Luna. Terra Luna, the same network that was connected to FTX and Alameda Research. And the board of Sam Bankman-Fried was Sullivan and Cromwell. Sullivan and Cromwell, the same lawyers that represent Mossad, CIA, and MI6, that were the board of FTX, that were connected via MIT, the same MIT that funds the research for the military-industrial complex that justifies the Palestinian laboratory crimes against humanity that were beta tested in Gaza that are now being used and integrated into Palantir in border control and pre-crime arrests in the UK right now. That same network came down as a result of a currency war on Terra Luna. That same currency war that manufactured Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel, the guy that made all his money out of covert operations and currency speculation that allowed him to fund a VC fund called Founders Fund that funded much of the technology that built the technological industrial complex, that was planning with Jeffrey Epstein how to infiltrate the Bitcoin community. The same FTX that was built a stable coin that connected Silicon Valley Bank, Silvergate Bank, Signature Bank, that was taken down by FDIC after Operation Choke Point 2.0 because Peter Thiel came up on a space on X that I was on and said, I'm taking all my money out of Silicon Valley Bank and everyone should do the same. So he manufactured a run on Silicon Valley Bank that took out the stablecoin network, and then shortly after he launched his bank, while SBF was taken out. And what did we get after Operation Choke Point 2.0? You had Wall Street launching Bitcoin industrial complex. You had JP Morgan saying we hate Bitcoin while he was building derivative complex. You had Fidelity building out its custody service. You had the public offering of Coinbase. You had the SEC weakening all of the companies under the Biden administration. And once all that apparatus was set up, we had BlackRock applying for the ETF. We had Strategy taking a dead public company and suddenly becoming a Bitcoin treasury company that suddenly got all the corporate debt investors and all the equity investors to create a construct that would centralize as much Bitcoin as possible into one corporate shell. In come the Trump administration. He penetrated the Bitcoin community with David Bailey, spoke at the Bitcoin conference, and said, "We will create a Bitcoin strategic reserve that will pump your banks up to kingdom come." Instead, they created crypto capital, the Orwellian surveillance state nightmare. They used World Liberty Financial and meme coins to extract as much wealth as possible. They created money laundering stable coins and selling out and prostituting pardons to extract as much money as they possibly could through pump and dump scams. They launched public companies into Bitcoin mining operations. They and then they created a regulatory environment that allowed the technical industrial complex and the financial industrial complex to have their stablecoin Genius Act, now potentially Clarity Act, a bit of an internal struggle there. And Cantor Fitzgerald, Howard Lutnick, started infiltrating the community, started with Tether and solved their banking issues. I'm very skeptical about that hack in 2016. I was intimately involved and became a shareholder in Bitfinex as a result of that. You can look at the flow there. Do we really believe that it was the crocodile of Wall Street, Razak Khan, and the husband that went to prison, who was also connected to Ukraine and Israel? Whenever you hear Lazarus and North Korea, think Israel. This is where the crimes against humanity with plausible deniability of Mick and Tick and Fick happen. The money goes back to the US stock market. But anyway, you had Operation Choke Point 2.0. You wiped out the crypto-friendly bank. You regime changed the system. You give the industry to BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. You had Peter Thiel, who'd long-term used the Epstein network to try and infiltrate the developers. Started funding Coinbase, Blockstream, various other things. You used Brock Pierce as the front from the Epstein network. Brock Pierce tried to tell me that Dr. Craig Wright was Satoshi Nakamoto. Satoshi Nakamoto led into the hard fork wars. You tried to get everyone over on Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin SV. But what the real goal was to launch the stable coins, which, guess what? Brock Pierce sold to Tether, which became rebranded as Tether, Realcoin, I think it was originally, with his connections to Jeffrey Epstein. And so it kind of comes back to the origin story of Bitcoin as well, which they tried to psyop as well, and pretend that Jeffrey Epstein created Bitcoin, which anyone that studies this is absolutely ludicrous. But it kind of comes back to a Bitcoin story, and I think we get closer to understanding the roots of this. But getting back to finishing off that thread, Operation Choke Point 2.0, I think I followed the money. I read 4,000 court documents in the Celsius bankruptcy because I was a small percentage of my Bitcoin I decided to borrow against it, and I got punished and became a $45 million creditor that made me the 7th largest creditor in the bankruptcy case. There were 650,000 victims, suicides, people that had to come out of retirement because Mashinsky persuaded them to put all their money in this scam. And I spent 2 years in court, and I read every single document. Pages, I got a stack of documents that I read. I followed every single part of the FTX case, the Gemini case, the Genesis case, the Terra Luna case, because I wanted the Tether case. We ended up suing Tether, and settling for about $500 million or so. Every part of the banking operation, I spent 3 years obsessing day and night over understanding every transaction, every flow of fund, everything I could find out about what happened there. And it was deeply, from my mind, coordinated, and Peter Thiel is your guy. And Brock Pierce was the front man for the Jeffrey Epstein network in our industry. And the goal was to take out that network that was being built around stablecoins that connected Alameda, FTX with those crypto-friendly banks, engineer a rug pull discredit the industry, target the industry. And again, this doesn't take away from the crimes. We had all sorts of criminals in our industry. I'm not trying to paint them as victims. They deserve to rot in hell in prison for what they did. They were just as bad. Please don't take this as me painting our industry as the victims. This was a way you penetrate an industry is you install the criminals and you get them to extract, then you expose the scheme. And Peter Thiel is a manufactured private corporate interest guy that made his money from currency wars, connected to George Soros. George Soros is Scott Bessent's guy. Scott Bessent is the Treasury Secretary. Howard Lutnick is the Commerce Secretary. And Howard Lutnick, through Cantor Fitzgerald, that backed up the treasuries for Tether, set about trying to build as many collateralized debt obligations so that they could acquire key infrastructure in Bitcoin and centralize it. So he went after Jack Mallers and said, let's get Bitcoin-backed loans merged into 21 Capital, partnered with, funded by Tether. Let's get Adam back to probably reverse merge all of that mining operations from Blockstream.
I have to ask you about the Bitcoin-backed loans, though, because there's a big difference between the way that Celsius were doing it and the way that a Strike or a Ledden are doing it in terms of the rehypothecation of the loan. Do you think they're intrinsically bad? Because if you want liquidity for your Bitcoin and you manage the amount of Bitcoin you're borrowing against well, then surely that's a good tool to have as a Bitcoiner.
Okay. When you analyze the parts in themselves, they could be all legitimate and fine. I'm not saying that Jack Mallers is doing Celsius. I'm saying that leveraging your Bitcoin means that you have to custody your Bitcoin and you are subject to Bitcoin with time put onto it. Where if you can't meet your interest payments and you don't have reserves for a margin call, you lose your Bitcoin and it ends up in the financial industrial complex. It's a mechanism for centralizing Bitcoin. What you need next is to manufacture wild price swings. Wild price swings is how you get margin calls. So you wrap up as much leverage, perpetual futures, you create custody service. Your goal is to get as much Bitcoin in your custody as possible. Then with Adam back, you do the mining side, Blockstream, questionable. The Epstein files relieve no accusations here, but very questionable in terms of Adam back didn't answer around his invitation and confirmation in the Epstein files that he visited the island. Still has to answer for that. He confirmed he received funding through Blockstream and divested, but he didn't confirm the rest. And, take with that what you want. I'm just sharing what was revealed in the files. And suddenly he's a Bitcoin treasury guy and a stablecoin guy. And, you need to analyze through incentives. That's the most important thing here. I'm not saying these people are bad people. I am saying the financial industrial complex creates tools to subordinate you into an incentive structure that plays into their agenda. How do you control price? You create an arbitrage vehicle. The perfect arbitrage vehicle for centralizing as much Bitcoin as possible under the investment of the financial industrial complex is strategy, combined with preference notes, digital credit, digital whatever you want to call it. These are preference shares. And these preference shares mean that you create a game of arbitrage so that Jane Street, the hedgies, can arbitrage using their appointed representative and connected to the Bitcoin ETFs in order to manufacture price swings that centralize as much Bitcoin as possible from anyone that is holding it in custody and leveraging their Bitcoin, or instead of buying Bitcoin in self-custody, buying a Bitcoin treasury company instead. I think they've now got approximately 3 million Bitcoin, an incredibly successful operation across all these centralizing vectors. Fortunately, the vast
So
majority.
that 3 million's across things like Strategy, Coinbase, all that, like the big players.
Yeah, so I invested in 100 companies that when Bitcoin was on the mission of taking on the FIC and taking on the banks, and one by one, every single one of them became FIC. So Kraken's now a bank and will be a public company, which means you're subordinate to FIC. Coinbase became a custodian and shitcoinery and went public, which means you're subordinate to FIC. Strategy was already a public company that where they repackaged that company into a Bitcoin centralization vehicle. I could go through the list of all of those companies, and FIC got as many of them as they could because it's an incentive structure. It's a strategy that works. And so Strategy is an arbitrage vehicle. If you want to arbitrage STRC around $100, then you can play with the dividend, you can stop the dividend, or you can start purchasing up the securities. The premium on Strategy equity can be diluted down. It's still at a premium. You just start issuing more equity in order to buy more Bitcoin. You arbitrage those vehicles, just like GBTC and Barry Silbert did. By the way, Barry Silbert, the brother of Alan Silbert, the proficient Zionist that created the INX security token exchange connected to Mossad operations. Every time I invested in those companies, suddenly, a few rounds later, the cap table had Barry Silbert from Digital Currency Group, Peter Thiel's Founders Fund, and then the Epstein covert networks via Brock Pierce and Blockchain Capital. So all I'm saying is that the infiltration network was there to try and get it. Now, you can take that as, again, the same battle as I covered before. What is the real battle? The real battle is Bitcoin in custody and Bitcoin in self-custody. And you choose. Do you have it in self-custody? And there's an advantage of self-custody. You can contribute to running nodes and preserving the integrity of the network. And if you choose, you can engage in a bit of self-mining. And guess what? Multipolarity is the best environment for maintaining the integrity of decentralization in the Bitcoin mining industry. They tried to centralize it in China, and then they tried to centralize it through public companies by FIC in Texas in America. Multipolarity meant that there were resistance against the Bitcoin mining. Iran, Russia, El Salvador. The two centralizing forces, PBOC and Federal Reserve, I think PBOC in China has about 20% of the Bitcoin hash rate. The public companies owned by FIC or controlled by FIC or influenced by FIC in Texas is about 40% of the hash power. The rest is Russia, Iran, Central South America, European, various other ways. We need to fight. This is the beautiful about multipolarity. Multipolarity creates the opportunity for sovereign miners to maintain the integrity of countries that hate each other mining Bitcoin in an environment where you can always say, hey, we ain't taking no stable coins. We ain't playing for your PSYOP, Peter Thiel, Howard Lutnick, Trump family, Kushner family. We'll take the Bitcoin direct. And it gave them negotiation leverage in negotiating against FIC, which is why they want to centralize as much as possible, because they don't want it to be your leverage. And by leverage, I mean negotiation leverage rather than physical leverage. They definitely want it to be physical leverage so they can margin call you. They want it to be their leverage because that's one of their negotiation tools into multipolarity. So you either have the tool, your country self-custodies it, your company self-custodies it, or you give it to Coinbase and the FIC network so it becomes their leverage and they can gain more power. That's the game.
Despite all this, do you think Bitcoin still has a shot?
Absolutely. Why would the most the most important power structure in the world, next to China and PBOC, the financial industrial complex, with trillions and trillions and trillions of assets under management, bother having an infiltration operation for this thing that doesn't matter? Gold mattered. So they did the same thing that they're trying to do to Bitcoin as they did with gold. They said it gives people an exit if they self-custody. So let's provide the custody service so everyone gives it to us. And then we'll try and corner as much of it, but we still want it to exist. Why? Because gold is our exit. We want gold to be our exit. We want to utilize it to be able to negotiate, to concentrate more power for ourselves. FIC wants the same with Bitcoin. Bitcoin improves upon the properties of auditability, transportability, and the ability to take the self-custody Bitcoin and own your money with no counterparty, send your money with no government, and protect yourself from central banking money printing in the long term. So let's oppress the price for as long as we can, and let's centralize as much of it as we can. But we don't want to kill it. Why would I want to make strategy bankrupt and put it in Chapter 11? It's the perfect vehicle for short-term manipulating the price of Bitcoin with the arbitrages and the hedges. That's why it's so liquid. It's one of the most liquid options market and arbitrage markets in the world. You think that comes from retail? That's Jane Street. That's the financial industrial complex. That's a mechanism for doing to Bitcoin what they did to gold. So you have to be patient. You're either going to give them your Bitcoin, but they'll be more patient. They'll try and be more patient than the short-term speculators that they've manufactured, where they want to make money in shitcoinery and all sorts of stuff. They'll want you to be levered up. They'll say you either become our Bitcoin collateralized debt obligation, or we'll, so that we can try and get your Bitcoin in custody. But we don't want you to self-custody it. That's what they don't want. So you resist by self-custody. It comes down to your opinion on why Bitcoin was created in the first place. I recently shared my opinion, shared by other people as well. I personally believe that Satoshi Nakamoto was Len Sassaman. And Len Sassaman, again, I think a documentary came out. I covered this a while back. Dr. Jack Cruz was someone else that covered this as well. And there was a documentary that recently came out that also reached the same conclusion.
Seeking Satoshi, I think it was called. It came to the conclusion that it was Len Sassaman and Hal Finney together. I mean, it was a good documentary. Like, they put together a pretty strong case, I think. It's one of the better ones I've seen.
Yeah, I haven't actually watched it yet, so I'm going to watch it. But Len Sassaman was, studied under David Chom. David Chom was DigiCash. DigiCash was shut down because they built private money on top of the banking system. So just like Operation Checkpoint 2.0, they used that to shut it down. I'm not making any accusations here, but when they shut things down, just like they did with CZ, you get to negotiate favorable conditions if you serve certain three-letter agency agendas. I believe that from that, they wanted to create what is the Orwellian stablecoin CBDC network of digital currency, and that was the purpose of the project. Len Sassaman studied under David Chom. There were several companies that were set up in Netherlands and the same university where David Chom was the teacher, and he was the cryptography cypherpunk student. There were connections to the cypherpunk movement connecting Len Sassaman to Hal Finney. I believe Hal Finney did the first transaction. It's plausible to me that Len Sassaman wrote the white paper. And that white paper was a resistance movement against what they actually wanted to create. because the white paper outlined how to do it with open source code in a distributed supercomputer. It mentioned Adam Back in terms of what he'd created through PGP, through spam prevention on email, but it wasn't Adam Back. Adam Back was catching up with Bitcoin through his own self-admission in 2013. The same time that later became Blockstream, Peter Thiel network, funding, all the penetration that happened around then. The first communication between Jeffrey Epstein was when he wanted to contact Gavin Andresen and Amir Taki. Amir Taki was the guy that invited me to the first Bitcoin conference after I went to visit a squat in Old Street where some Bitcoin developers were coding in Bitcoin Core, including Amir Taki, who wanted to work on the technology that Peter Todd tried to stop happening, which was CoinJoin and privacy on top of Bitcoin. Amir Taki was contacted by Jeffrey Epstein. He sent his business partner to go meet him. If you look at what happened in 2011, Gavin Andresen turned down the meeting with Jeffrey Epstein. But all around that time, you had Julian Assange and WikiLeaks saying they wanted to use Bitcoin. Satoshi saying, we're not ready. I'm scared of this attention. We had the handover to Gavin Andresen. Gavin Andresen then said, I'm going to tell everybody I'm meeting with the CIA to explain Bitcoin. Gavin Andresen then met with the CIA. Then 1 month after that, Len Sassaman allegedly committed suicide. We know that Hal Finney was involved in the first transaction, and we know his causes of death. And I think that's quite right that those were the two key people. And this was around the time that the next communication after that was in the Epstein files was Peter Thiel around 2014. And he was communicating via introductions through Brock Pierce how to destabilize the market around unit of account, median of exchange, and store of value was the communications. And this is when Brock Pierce co-founded and funded what later became Tether. Then we had the creation of the Bitcoin Foundation, which had all the controversial characters. They got taken out one by one. Mark Capellas with the hack of Mt. Gox, Charlie Shrem with money laundering for Silk Road, the Brock Pierce, he had all his allegations and history of sex crimes that was settled. Read into that what you will. He was a childhood actor in Hollywood. We know how that industry works. He was involved in Silicon Valley, had a pump and dump during the dot-com boom and bust. We know what happened there. And then he had the sex allegations, which are publicly available. I'm just sharing what's publicly available. Then in 2014, we had the connection with Brock Pierce, Peter Thiel. But in that 2011 period, we don't know, Gavin Andresen was really the lead developer. And then we kind of led into the offshoots like Mike Hearn with Google, which wanted to create KYC on chain. And we led into the whole big block, small block debate. And big blockers like to say via Blockstream that was the infiltration with the small block movement. I personally believe that was an attempt, but they miss out the second half, which was the infiltration of the big block movement. If you look at all of those characters, it ended up with Gavin Andresen, John Matonis, and Brock Pierce were the last people standing in Bitcoin Foundation. Then Bitcoin Foundation went bust. Then the project handed over to MIT Digital Innovation Lab. MIT is prolific for military industrial complex innovation funding. And so then you had Gary Gensler, who was one of the head teachers later. But the funding then came over, and then we had the alternative competing funding sources. But the Bitcoin Foundation was taken out. Brock Pierce ended up the last man standing. And what did Gavin Andresen do? Well, Brock Pierce tried to personally persuade me that Dr. Craig Wright was Satoshi Nakamoto. And he spent a lot of time trying to do that at Bitcoin conferences and various other things. He then sold Tether to Bitfinex. They had all their banking issues and hacks that then made them subordinate to eventually Cantor Fitzgerald in terms of solving those issues. Later, we had Operation Choke Point 2.0 and all the different things. We had the tokenization of the security token as a result of the Bitfinex hack. A lot of these types of innovation came from these interesting times. And because I was a shareholder in them, I was able to experience it firsthand. But Gavin Andresen was the one with a meeting from John Matonis, the head of the Bitcoin Foundation, that said, I have cryptographic proof that Dr. Craig Wright is Satoshi Nakamoto. He said he got scammed and later retrieved that, but he lied at the time or was scammed. And then ended up connecting into the fork, Bitcoin Cash, which was funded by Bitmain in China and Jihan Wu, who received investment from Sequoia Capital, who is the Silicon Valley of China that was recently shut down by China for infiltration operations and repackaged into Hong Kong. Using Dr. Craig Wright, who Gavin Andresen said was Satoshi Nakamoto, and the credibility of the developer that Satoshi Nakamoto handed over to, but also Adam Back around 2013 catching up in Bitcoin, creating Blockstream, centralizing many of the developers that many of those developers then broke away from. And then started to, so there's parts of this story. And once you understand it, you realize, well, I personally believe that digital currency was originally a PSYOP intelligence operation that came from DigiCash in order to create CBDCs and stablecoins. And the white paper was an anonymous resistance from that to create something that could be held in self-custody, where you own your own money, can spend your own money, enforced by a decentralized network of supercomputers that originally consist of probably Len Sassaman and Hal Finney to begin with. Then we had 1 million of Bitcoin into the Satoshi wallets. And then we had the death of those who were likely able to control those keys. Read into that whatever you choose. Then we had the infiltration operations. And then we had several wars and hard forks. I think each one of those was Bitcoin, the decentralized project, becoming stronger and stronger through every infiltration operation. The latest infiltration operation is Wall Street and the financial industrial complex that is trying to wrap Bitcoiners into subordination vehicles. So you take the biggest Bitcoin conference, Bitcoin magazine and media outlet, a hedge fund, and a conference, and you wrap them up into a Bitcoin treasury company. You take one side of developer influence via Adam Back and Blockstream that is doing lots of mining operations, and you wrap them up into a thick Wall Street vehicle. You take others that are doing Bitcoin-backed loans, and you wrap them up into another Wall Street vehicle Cantor Fitzgerald did all of that. The same one that was holding the bonds for the stablecoin project and custodying them. Then you need a vehicle for manipulating the price and shaking people out of their Bitcoin and margin calling people. That's strategy. You create all the tools for the Bitcoin derivative complex to be able to create the biggest amount of liquidity. And then you can really just look at the inflows and outflows managed by BlackRock Aladdin into the Bitcoin ETF. The arbitrage managed by Jane Street and the hedge fund intelligence network. And the investment banking Wall Street vehicles of Bitcoin treasury companies to try and M&A as much of the infrastructure into subordination vehicles. You load them up with corporate debt. You make the exchanges public companies. And now if you look at Nakamoto and David Bailey, all the Bitcoin's in Kraken. And they can margin call Nakamoto out of existence and consolidate it and M&A it. That's the purpose of these vehicles. Strategy is the centralized vehicle that they never want to take away. It's got a perfect engineered way of getting as much Bitcoin in that wrapper. And then you take all the ones around it, which are the sacrifice ones. A bit like BlackRock with Operation Chokepoint 2.0 and Peter Thiel's bank. You choose. What did they do in 2008? They chose the winners. JP Morgan and BlackRock. They were going to be the winners. Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, you sacrifice. You do an operation called mortgage-backed securities, which came from those banks by Larry Fink. And then you lever up everybody into mortgages. Then you engineer a pump and dump cycle and you socialize the losses and privatize the gains. Then the Federal Reserve gives the contract to BlackRock in order to manage who dies and who stays alive. What did they acquire? They acquired the ETF division of Barclays, the previous empire. Barclays had the ETF market and the FX market. BlackRock got it. That was a transition up to a more centralizing force of BlackRock that now has trillions, and they had, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of assets under administration. That 2008 was the same breakaway movement that led to Bitcoin being created in the first place. So the answer is, we are in a battle. And you have to decide if you're going to participate in that battle. You only have two choices. You make FIC more powerful in order to control more of Bitcoin, or you self-custody it, run your own node, engage in whatever you can in a multipolar world, making decentralized communities, and maybe some of those decentralized communities contribute to decentralized AI and decentralized Bitcoin mining. And you build. And I think we'll win. And the reason I know that I think we'll win is because the control grid and the control network always has breakaways that act in their own self-interest that want to exit the system. The reason that the British Empire left a load of tax haven territories is because the elites wanted them. The reason that Bitcoin and self-custody will still exist is because the elites want them. And so you get to benefit from that and play and participate in that. But most of you are going to be custodied, collateral debt obligations, cheering on celebrities that wrap themselves in Wall Street wrappers to margin call you and get your Bitcoin. And it's not a binary. I get it. Life kicks in. There's degrees of sovereignty. There's degrees of this. You have to put some of your wealth in that network to preserve some of the wealth, the majority of the wealth outside that network. You have to play their games. I can't just boycott AI. I'd be the most unproductive person in the world. You still have to play their game. But we need a core group of people that get powerful within the existing system and don't get compromised. The way you don't get compromised is you take away the layers. You don't create the Bitcoin treasury company. You don't launch your own shitcoin. You don't engage in taking your whole stack and borrowing against it. You don't try the degeneracy gambling perpetual futures that give more power to them. You take their vehicles and you get more and more of it every single day, every single week, and every single month into self-custody. You learn how to run nodes and you build your decentralized communities around that. And you become somebody that is the most dangerous. There's only two types of people that this system doesn't mind. They don't mind broke-ass people moaning and whinging all day about Jeffrey Epstein compromised networks and Trump corruption because you got no freaking power. You can't buy the lobby. In fact, it's kind of like the Colosseum. Just let the plebs kill each other and be, with the gladiators, distract them with their sports and just let them whinge all day. They got no power. It doesn't matter. They got freedom of speech, but they can't do shit with their freedom of speech. If you get wealthy, they want you compromised. They want you in their control grids. They want you in a Wall Street vehicle. They want you Jeffrey Epstein. They want you engaging in degeneracy, so they got blackmail operations. They want you levered. They want you Elon Musked. They want you, the trillionaire can have his entire net worth wiped out because they borrowed against his stock. He's got subordinated to FIC. He requires military capital to achieve his goal for tick. And he is as subordinated as they get. If you want to wipe out, if Elon Musk doesn't comply, you wipe out his net worth overnight. He gets to play that. But the wealth he's got outside the system in self-custody is his vehicle for fighting against the oppression networks. Because that's network. You're a trillionaire when you can send $1 trillion of Bitcoin or send $1 trillion of gold without needing any shipment or port or government to do it. And at the moment, no one can do that. But if you can, those are the people that they don't want. They don't want powerful people that are sovereign outside of their system. They're rare because they're able to go on what Bitcoin did and talk about shit that no one else can talk about because they're preserving their self-interest. Your other guests that have companies, that have leverage, that have other things, have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders. I had a fiduciary duty to my shareholders. I sold my company to Coinbase. I got rid of all my private equity investments. I spent trying to get rid of as many subordination vehicles as I could so that I could have this conversation with you today. Because will Bitcoin win? Yes, because FU money has to exist. Because elites want it. And guess what? I get some of the most powerful people, celebrities now from Hollywood. It's really strange. As AI has kind of disrupted industries, previous power structures, I get, after watching some of my content, a major Hollywood director, someone that I thought, why is this person contacting me? He's saying, Simon, your message of sovereignty, I know how Hollywood works. I know how Wall Street works. I know how Silicon Valley works. How do I get free? And I tell them, own more Bitcoin every month than the last month. Own more Bitcoin this week than last week. Own more Bitcoin today than you did yesterday. Self-custody, run a node, and invest in community infrastructures. Build your freedom. And over time, have a 10-year plan. Bitcoin is the vehicle, and they don't want you to have a 10-year plan. They want you to have a 10-minute plan, levered up to the kilt in ETF, BlackRock, leverage, income, collateralized debt obligation, Bitcoin-backed option, subordinated, collateralized Michael Saylor obligations. That's what they want you to have. Again, nothing against these people. This is what FIC does. It subordinates. It co-ops. It wants you in their network. And once you have a fiduciary duty to their capital, you're gone. You're captured. You work for them. And your job is to free yourself.
Oh, man. I love it. I don't think there's any better way to end the show. So I've taken over 2 hours of your time. This has been awesome. Bitcoin is winning. Bitcoin will continue to win. Hold Bitcoin in self-custody. Nothing else to say. I love it.
Thanks
Thank you, man.
me.
This has been cool. We'll have to do it again. I've still got about 50 questions written down here that we didn't get to. So next time.
Yeah, one day I'll give you a short answer, Danny. It may happen.
No, that was incredible. I appreciate the time, man.